In Module 1, we talked about the QA mindset, the shift from executing to evaluating, from get it done to prove it's right. Now we need to talk about the framework that defines what right actually means. That framework is the regulatory landscape. I know what you might be thinking: regulations, guidelines, legal texts, this is going to be dry. But it doesn't have to be. Regulations aren't bureaucratic obstacles invented by people who've never been in a clean room. They are the accumulated lessons of decades of pharmaceutical failures, of patients who were harmed because quality systems weren't good enough. Every major regulation has a story behind it. When you understand the story, the rule makes sense. So in this module, we're going to understand the structure, who writes the rules, why, how they connect, and what you actually need to know to function in a QA role in Europe and Switzerland. Let's go. Why regulations exist. Before we look at what the regulations say, let's spend a few minutes on why they exist, because this context changes everything. Most of the major pharmaceutical regulations we work under today were shaped by disasters. The one that changed everything was the thalidomide crisis in the 1950s and 60s. Thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness. It was never properly tested for safety in pregnancy. The result? More than 10,000 children were born with severe birth defects across multiple countries. The US was partially spared because an FDA reviewer, Francis Oldham-Kelsey, refused to approve the drug, citing insufficient safety data, and she was right. The backlash from that crisis led directly to legislation that dramatically strengthened drug oversight and required manufacturers to prove both safety and efficacy. Europe had its own journey. The EU GMP framework evolved through a series of directives over several decades, eventually consolidated into what we now call EudraLex Volume 4. Switzerland, operating outside the EU, has its own law, the Heilmittelgesetz, or HMG, but it's closely aligned with EU standards. And globally, the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization, was set up in 1990 to align regulations between the EU, the US, and Japan. Before ICH, a drug company that wanted to sell in multiple markets had to run 3 separate sets of clinical trials, 3 sets of documentation, 3 different submissions. ICH harmonized the science. Same data, multiple approvals. Here is why this matters to you. When you understand that every GMP requirement has a reason, protecting a patient from something that went wrong somewhere else, you stop seeing the rules as pointless bureaucracy. You start seeing them as a system built by people who learned hard lessons. That's the mindset of a QA professional. The regulatory landscape. Let me map out the regulatory landscape you'll encounter in a European or Swiss pharmaceutical environment. Think of it as 3 layers. Layer 1, international guidelines. That's ICH. At the top, you have the ICH guidelines. These are not laws, a scientific consensus documents agreed between regulators and industry. The ones you'll encounter most often, ICH Q8, pharmaceutical development. How do you design a drug product and manufacturing process? ICH Q9, quality risk management, the likelihood, severity, detectability framework I introduced in Module 1. This is its formal home. ICH Q10, pharmaceutical quality system, the overarching quality system model. ICH Q11, development and manufacture of drug substances for active pharmaceutical ingredients. ICH Q12 is lifecycle management, managing changes to approved products over time. These guidelines aren't directly enforced as law, but regulators in Europe and the US expect companies to align with them. Layer 2 is regional regulations. In the European Union, the key document for GMP is EUDRELEX Volume 4. It's divided into Part 1, GMP for finished pharmaceutical products. This is the core. If you work in final dosage form manufacturing, this is your Bible. Part 2, GMP for active substances. And the annexes, specific requirements for sterile products, biological products, computerized systems, and more. Annex 1 covers sterile manufacturing and was comprehensively revised in 2022. If you work in biologics or sterile fill finish, Annex 1 is the document you need to know inside out. In Switzerland, the primary law is the Heilmittelgesetz, HMG. The enforcement body is Swissmedic. Swiss GMP requirements are harmonized with EU GMP. So if your site complies with EUDRELEX Volume 4, you're largely compliant with Swiss requirements too. But Swissmedic runs its own inspection program. If you're based in Switzerland, they're your regulator. Layer 3, company level documents. Below regional regulations, you have your company's own quality system, the SOPs, policies, specifications, and procedures that translate regulatory requirements into site-specific instructions. This is where most of your day-to-day QA work lives. The chain goes ICH guideline to EU or Swiss regulation to company SOP to batch to operator instruction and to batch record entry. And that chain is quality in action. What GMP actually means. GMP stands for Good Manufacturing Practice. At its core, it's a set of principles that ensure pharmaceutical products are consistently produced and controlled to quality standards appropriate for their intended use. GMP isn't a single universal standard. It's scaled to risk. A sterile injectable that goes directly into a patient's bloodstream has much higher GMP requirements than a dietary supplement. The risk to the patient is different. The requirements reflect that. The 6 core principles of GMP, I want you to know these. They come up in interviews and they underpin every document you'll ever write. 1. Quality management system. There must be a documented, functioning quality system. Not just policies in a filing cabinet, an actual system of procedures, oversight, and accountability. 2. Personnel. There must be enough qualified trained staff to run the quality system. This includes the qualified person in Europe, the individual legally accountable for releasing batches. 3. Premises and equipment. Facilities and equipment must be designed, constructed, and maintained to suit the operations performed. Contamination prevention is built into the design. 4. Documentation. Everything that matters must be documented in real time, accurately, and in a way that allows reconstruction of what happened. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. You'll hear this a lot, it's true. 5. Production, manufacturing. Operations must follow validated, documented processes. Deviations from those processes must be recorded and investigated. 6. Quality control. QC encompasses the sampling, testing, and release procedures that confirm a product meets its specifications before it reaches a patient. When someone hands you a GMP task, whatever it is, ask yourself, which of these 6 principles am I supporting right now? It gives you context for why the task exists. Reading regulations without going mad. A practical note before we close, because this comes up constantly. How do you actually read a regulatory document without either falling asleep or panicking? First, read for intent, not words. Ask, what problem is this section trying to prevent? What patient harm does this requirement guard against? Once you see the intent, the specific wording becomes much easier to interpret. Second, use the structure. EUDRELEX Volume 4 Part 1 is organized by chapter. When you encounter a GMP question, go to the relevant chapter first. Don't try to read the whole thing linearly. Third, know which annexes apply to you. You don't need to know all 20 annexes. You need to know the ones relevant to your site. Fourth, use your company SOPs as your starting point. Your SOPs are already an interpretation of the regulatory requirements. Read the SOP and the regulation side by side. Fifth, regulations evolve. The Annex 1 revision in 2022 was significant. FDA warning letters regularly signal where regulatory focus is shifting. Keep up. You don't need to know everything. You need to know enough to recognize when something is relevant and know where to look. The regulatory framework exists because patients were harmed when it didn't, or when it existed and was ignored. Understanding the structure, ICH at the top, EU and Swiss regulations in the middle, your company's quality system at the bottom gives you a map. And when you have a map, you're not lost in the document. You know where you are, what layer you're in, and why the requirement exists. In Module 3, we're going to get practical. We're going to look at the core GMP documents, the batch record, the SOP, the deviation report, what they are, how they're structured, and what good ones actually look like from a QA perspective. That's where the regulatory framework stops being theory and starts being your daily work. I'll see you in Module 3.